And today, is that thought still prevail?
Oh, sure, yeah. In many traditions, in India, for example, it's based around the idea that there is some true self. But they have different ways of looking at it depending on the tradition.
So what would be the true self then? Each of us have this individual true self.
Well, according to the Buddha, there is nothing there.
Right.
It's just a constant flow of mental and physical elements. And holding on to this idea of a true self is actually suffering in and of itself. And the crux of our problems, the roots of why we get upset over anything, is because we identify with something. And when we identify something and that something is threatened, then we get upset, we do all sorts of things. We become greedy, selfish, of course. So the root of all of that comes down to identification. Identification with things that the cumulative effect is that it feels like, oh, this is who I am. This is myself.
Ego perhaps.
Yeah, ego, you could say, is a modern psychological term that we could roughly equate with a sense of self.
Well, where is the self? Where am I? Am I here? Am I here? Am I here?
Yeah, well, that's a good question to ask. Where are you? Are you here? Well, what's here?
Am I in the ceiling?
Physical body? Well, even what's your physical body? I mean, what part of your physical body is you, really? If you cut your hand off in an accident, then does that mean you no longer exist by 5%? If you lose your arm, does that mean you no longer exist by 10%? You say, well, no, I'm still here, I just lost my arm, but it's my arm. Even if it's cut off, laying in a jar of formaldehyde, you still think, oh, it's still my arm. Well, in what way is it ours anymore? And even when it's still attached to our body, in what way is it truly ours? Well, actually, what is it? It's just like, okay, there's bones and flesh and skin and blood and all that, but what is that? That's just certain elements. I mean, there's fluids and liquids and solids and just, it's made up of elements from the earth and the air, and it's just temporarily combined. And then we think it's us, they think it's me. Right? That's just the body.
So if someone hits me across the face, I'll get upset. For what?
No, you don't have to. We can test it out. If you think, anytime you think you're really making progress in your equanimity and peace of mind, then someone could help you test it by slapping you in the face. And then, right?
Then you turn the other cheek, is it?
You turn the, yeah, that's the other book.
It gets back to where am I?
If you, yeah. You can ask, where am I? If that leads into a valid investigation of what is it that I identify with, right? But don't assume there's an I. Sometimes how we phrase the question is also very important. If you say, well, where is my true self? It's like you're assuming that there already is a true self, right? Where is my unchanging true self?
Because it's changing all the time.
Right. So if it's changing all the time, can we really call it a true self? We can call it conventionally. Conventionally, there is a sense of self that other people can recognize, right? We change slowly enough that there is some continuity from day to day that we can say, this person's like this and this person's like that. It's not like radical day by day, but over a period of 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, the way we were when we were 20 may be very different than how we are when we're 70. Not just physically, but mentally. Our personalities may be modified quite a bit. So there's a gradual change. So if that's the case, well, who is the real person then? Is it the real person when we became an adult, or when we're middle-aged, or when we're old, or when we're a baby? I mean, where does this, So there is this, when we're living, there's this assumption or a feeling. It's like a feeling and perception that, yeah, I exist and this is who I am, but I'm gradually changing and this is what I'm like. Or maybe some things really don't change. You know, we have this idea that I've always been this way, I'll probably always will be this way, it's not going to change, it's just who I am. But those are assumptions that we should look at. You know, we look at it and start to investigate. Certainly with the body, you think, well, okay, this is my body today, but what did my body look like 10 years ago? You know? So, which is the real me? We do the same thing with memories. We identify with memories. This is my personal history. And yet, actually, memories keep changing. You know? Our memories are very inaccurate. They'll keep changing and modifying. And same thing with our views or opinions. We may have views or opinions. This is right. I know what's right. This is, you have views and opinions on all sorts of things. And then maybe a year from now our views change, our opinions change. And then we think, no, this is right. That was wrong. And, so you see it's constantly modifying. So, in all of that, you just keep looking, well, what is it that I identify with as who I truly am? Right? My thoughts, or this personality. What do you mean by a personality? Where is it exactly? Or underneath the personality, where is this idea of this is who I really am? Where is it? So this is all tied up with this idea of emptiness, very much. Whether you use the term emptiness, sunyata, or anatta, non-self, it's very similar. It's very similar. It's just like maybe different angles that you look. That you can look from and investigate and try to see and understand. Yeah, it's very helpful for normal functioning in daily life and communication.
Yes.
If you go to the car park and say, well, which car is your car? Say, well, ultimately, none of the cars are my car. Say, well, just tell me which car is your car. I need to go. You say, well, none of the cars are truly my car. So conventionally, it makes it a lot more convenient if you just speak in terms of me and mine. Yeah? Otherwise, things can become ordinary communication can be kind of difficult. If you try to avoid using the terms me or mine or I. So yeah, conventionally, it still feels like this body is me, right? Or that body is you, or I am speaking, I am seeing, I am hearing, right? That all has the assumption that there is someone who is seeing and hearing and experiencing, and even just that constant unchallenged assumption that I am seeing, I am hearing, I am tasting, I am thinking, right? I'm comfortable, I'm uncomfortable. That I, it's constantly reinforcing the sense of self. Constantly reinforcing this assumption that there is someone here who's experiencing an external world. So this is part of what we want to challenge. Right? Even though conventionally we still operate that way. I mean, the Buddha could still have normal conversations and teach and function and give direction, and the enlightened teachers that I've seen are still very much engaged. They don't become a comatose vegetable that's just like there's no one here. Right? No, still very active, able to engage. In fact, probably able to engage even more effectively. But when they see, there's not the assumption that I am seeing. It is that there is seeing. Right? There is seeing. There is hearing. There are pleasant physical sensations or unpleasant physical sensations. But there doesn't have to be this sense of me seeing, me hearing, me being comfortable or uncomfortable. Right? You're just seeing these things are happening. Speaking is happening. Right? Sound is happening. Certain sounds then have certain concepts attached to these sounds, And so in that way we can try to communicate. But really it's just sound. There's sound, we're picking up sound, there's hearing, right? There are intentions that lead to particular words and sound. Right? So these things all exist, but they don't have to mean that there's actually some true self happening behind it. I can form, words can form based on past training and experience and learning. Right? It's all like the certain causes and conditions lead to certain results, and then that leads to further results, and then more influences lead to further results, and it keeps on rolling along.
So how do you link the concept of karma to the non-self?
There are causes and results.
Yeah.
And there are intentions, right? There are intentions in the mind, right? If conventionally speaking, we might say, oh, try to make good karma and refrain from bad karma, or do good karma, with this idea that if I have the right intentions, then I will make good karma and have good results in the future. So that is still,
But then you're
it's useful for encouraging people to act in a wholesome, good, and beneficial way. Ultimately, we can, if we have the right influence, then certain intentions will form in our minds. Those intentions lead to speech and action which can have beneficial results. So it's not actually that we are making an intention to do something, but circumstances can assist us in, or encourage us to give rise to certain intentions. There will be, those causes lead to certain intentions, those intentions then continue on. The law of karma then rolls on without there being any individual people involved. It's like it's all part of this flow. It doesn't mean that it's fixed, but things can be influenced, and then that will change the results. And every moment, the possible results are modifying, changing as different additives are put into the stream. Then the results modify a bit. Even though intentions seem very much like who we really are, right? So even if I wasn't able to control my body, right? If I lost control over my body, still, what aspect of my mind feels like me? Well, my intentions are something that are more easily to identify with as the core of who we are. This is my intention. My intention is like this, my motivation. Because even before we do something, we have to decide to do it, right? If I decide to lift this up, I have the intention to lift this up. That's how it feels, and then I act. But they can, more and more, they are doing systematic scientific studies on the brain and intention. And what they found is that in the decision-making process, before we are consciously aware of making a decision, it's measurable that in our brain that decision has already been made. And it's not just a matter of milliseconds. I mean, it's like a matter of a few seconds on average. Sometimes 5 seconds, as much as like 10 seconds. So they can measure the activity in the brain with EEG, and then accurately predict that the person will, say, for example, choose right or left, or red or blue. But the person who's undergoing the training, as soon as you've made this decision, right or left, one or two, then push this button. So as soon as they made that decision to go with this one, but then they measure the brain activity, and they can see that decision was already made pre-consciously, right? Prior to the person actually being aware of making the decision, that decision was already made. So that's very strange, because if we can't even identify with making decisions, then who's making the decisions? Or more accurately, what is this process where decisions are being made?
But wouldn't that mean that you can't necessarily control what you're doing?
So then it begs the question of, well, doesn't that mean that it's all like fate? You know, there is no free choice, really?
Yeah, 'cause
Everything is just kind of conditioned. You think you're making a free will decision, but actually it was already decided in your mind, and we can measure that that decision was decided already before you think that you have free will to make your decision. So does that mean that everything actually is fixed, and we have no real free will or choice in the matter? And yet at the same time, the Buddha clearly said that things are not fixed. The law of karma is not, it's not fixed. It's not like everything is written, preordained, and that we're just playing a role. And no matter what we do, it's always, the result is always going to be the same. Because there were other teachers in the time of the Buddha that taught like that, and he very clearly said, no, that's not the way it is. Right? There is this ability to interact with the law of karma. However we respond to the present moment, then we are creating the future. But then, what is it that is responding? If this idea that pops into our head, I'm making a decision, right? It's just like the consciousness arises to try to make us feel better, right? The decision has already been made in our minds.
Freud would talk about the subconscious. Jung would talk about the subconscious. And the subconscious feeds the conscious. So you're unconsciously being fed to your subconscious, to your conscious.
So, yeah, at some level of conscious, say, lack of before it's fully aware, you call it subconscious, whatever, yes, those are kind of modern psychological terms. Before there is awareness, self-awareness, even if we're being very mindful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about people who are just being scatterbrained,
No.
but if we're being very mindful of every second, still there's stuff going on in our brain that we have no access to. We cannot be aware of that. And so certain decisions are already being made, and then it pops up into our mind, oh yes, I'll choose blue or left or one.
You don't know why you did that.
Well, we tend to give ourselves reasons, or else we think, no, I just, it was a completely random decision, right? But it wasn't. In reality, it wasn't. There's reasons. There's always reasons behind it, whether we see all the reasons or not.
So you're suggesting that maybe the karma that you accumulated in the past has a hand in making those decisions for you before you become aware of them?
Sure, yes, very much. Everything that we've experienced and done, and all the intentions and actions, how we've lived our life, very much will have an influence in how we make decisions right here and right now. Absolutely.
Can we change bad karma?
You can't erase the effects of what we've done in the past until you reach certain stages of enlightenment. And then it is possible. Then you do cut off. It's not possible to work through all of our past bad karma because it's essentially infinite. The same is true of our good karma. Wholesome karma and the results, unwholesome karma and the results. It's essentially infinite. But the thread that holds it all together is the idea that we are self-existent. We are self. And when insight goes deeply enough to see through this illusion of self, this delusion, then much, at the first stage of awakening, Sotapanna, the vast majority of unwholesome karmic results is let go of. Right? But even before that stage, there's a lot we can do. Right? Let's say we've made a mistake, or we do something that we regret, and we know it's going to have some bad consequences. But if you do a lot of wholesome, good activities, that will tend to make it so you don't feel the results, the negative results, very much. You know the simile of a teaspoon of salt? Right? So, if you take a glass of water and you put a teaspoon of salt in there and stir it up and drink it, it's going to be very unpleasant, right? It's very salty. And that teaspoon of salt can represent a spoonful of bad karma or unwholesome karmic causes, right? And the water represents our mind, or a good karma. Now, if you take that same spoonful of salt and put it in one of our rain tanks, one of our water tanks full of pure rainwater, good quality water, put a teaspoon of salt in there, let it dissolve, and then you take a drink from that, you don't even notice it. If at all, you barely notice it, but you probably won't even notice the salty taste at all. So, in the same way, if we're doing a lot of very wholesome, good karma, then we tend not to notice the results of the bad karma that we make.
So if there is no self, how can this good or bad karma get attached to? Where does it get attached?
It gets attached to this because we are attached to a view of the self. It's like this sticky ball that then accumulates. It gets the karmic results. Get stuck to that.
Like a magnet with iron fire.
Huh?
Like a magnet with iron fire.
That's right. All right. All right. And then we just tend to exacerbate, especially the negative karma that we make. If we have a very strong sense of self, it tends to lead towards, we can easily get upset, right? If we have a very strong sense of self, then it's much more easy to be greedy. We want to be someone special. We want to be better than somebody else. It can be more competitive, and it can lead to all sorts of problems. It can lead to disharmony with family, friends, and colleagues, just because our self is offended. If we have a big sense of self, he didn't respect me or something, right? Easily offended, and so it can lead to all sorts of problems. And so, a more reduced or realistic sense of self, even we're not even talking deep insight, but just not a huge ego. If we just have a smaller ego, or an ego that's based more on wholesome things that we do, then it's much easier to be patient. It's much easier to be forgiving. It's much easier just to, if someone criticizes us, we just say, oh, never mind, that's fine. It's not true, it's never mind. It's just much easier not to try to take more than we need. Right? If we have a big ego and think, no matter how much money you have, it's still not enough. Right? If you have a smaller ego, it's just like, well, this is enough, I'm happy. It's easier to be happy, it's easier to be content and satisfied. So even just on a normal daily basis, it's very practical teaching.
meditation is the path for this.
I think just now when you talk about decisions already being made before the action, how does this gut feeling comes in?
Yeah. It's a relatively new, the scientific results are relatively new. And the whole idea that challenges who is actually making the decision, and even intuition, or what is intuition then, where you just kind of feel something is right. So maybe the intuition then is more trustworthy, right? Before it goes into a different part of their brain, which then is thinking of pros and cons and benefits and drawbacks and myself and these perceptions, right? Maybe the intuition is actually accessing the earlier part of the brain that just sort of knows, yeah, this is what feels right. And that's often why I think people can trust their intuition. Not always, so that can also be diluted, but yeah, it is very interesting how all these different aspects of the decision-making process are related. It really undermines this idea that I'm here, right? If I'm not making my own decisions, who is? What is? What is a decision-making process? There are clearly decisions that are made and results that come from that, but yeah, it really challenges who we think we are.
So what you're suggesting, that everything's preordained?
Well, no, I'm not suggesting that. And the Buddha clearly denied that. He said, no, it's not fixed. But again, with anything that the Buddha teaches, we're not supposed to just believe it. He doesn't encourage just believing some cosmological view of the way things are. It's like, no, investigate for yourself. But if you come to a conclusion that is directly opposite of the Buddha's, then you think, well, maybe I'll keep looking, investigating. But basically, we have to find out for ourselves and understand for ourselves.
So if you're saying that certain decisions are already made before you're aware of it, basically, wouldn't that take any responsibility from yourself?
Right, it leads into all sorts of moral issues.
Yeah.
Like if you commit a crime, you can say, well, the decision was just made before I was aware of it.
Yeah.
It's not really my fault. In what way do I have to take responsibility for this crime?
Yeah.
Right? That won't work very well in a society. You still have to, if someone's dangerous or killing people or stealing, then there has to be some kind of behavior modification in society to protect people. But ultimately, yes, can you hold anyone responsible? Conventionally, yeah, we have to. We encourage people to take responsibility for their actions. So we're not always feeling like a victim or blaming somebody else. Say, no, go ahead, take responsibility for the way things are, because most of the causes for the way things are now are things that we've done in the past. Not everything, but the majority of the causes that create the present are things that we did. Conventionally we did, or the karma that was made in the past leads to the present moment. And so it is healthy to take responsibility for that, because then that motivates us to have a positive influence in the present moment, which will then hopefully increase the benefit in the future. But again, all of this is using our sense of self in a wholesome way. Right? It's difficult, if not impossible, to jump right into complete non-self. So we start by taking the sense of self that we have, but then trying to use that to encourage taking responsibility and motivating to make good karma, right? This is all using the sense of self. Even developing loving kindness or forgiveness, right? Those meditations are based on may you be happy or may I be happy. You're still making use of this conventional sense of self. And then gradually, even that we can see as empty and non-self. And we can go beyond that. So anytime someone asks you, oh, why'd you go to the monastery today? You say, well, you know, the decision was made before I was consciously aware.